we get started, I do feel it's important to address the audience about this topic. We will not only be addressing topics related to the negative demiurgy of early Christianities in the second and third centuries, but we will also be addressing the historical roots of anti Semitism. I just want to be unequivocally clear that every guest here condemns any form of dehumanization, racism, or anti Semitism on any occasion. Welcome, Dr. Litwa. We're glad to have you back on the show.
Thank you, and happy Halloween. And it's quite a scary topic today. I hope I don't scare anyone just by my face. This was the very first time on StreamYard I noticed that there's an option in the settings to improve your appearance. And it didn't work, but I did click that button to get more high resolution. But apparently I just need a better camera. Anyway, glad to be here and take it away.
What do you think about Timaeus? I think that's the earliest reference to the demiurge.
Well, no, not the earliest. So demiurgos becomes just the common word for creator among Christians. But way back in the 5th century, you had Plato use this term in reference to craftsmen. Interestingly, demiurgos not only has this humdrum meaning of craftsman, so the guy who makes pots and pans, but it was a position in the Athenian General Assembly. So a demiurgos was a political position. And now I see, as an allusion to the Timaeus, this is something that Elliot said earlier, but we have 1, 2, 3, and now the 4th. Miguel, it is so good to see you.
I don't know if I'm late or early, but when people they're struggling with the Gnostics, I just think, oh, that's easy. If you're struggling, just either read Kierkegaard and listen to Johnny Cash, then start reading the Nag Hammadi library. You'll be in that mood,
Oh my gosh, yeah. Kierkegaard is the best.
You don't have an evil creator in Timaeus. In fact, Platonists, or at least the Orthodox ones, would have a allergic reaction to the creator being evil, because the whole point of the demiurgos in Timaeus is that he's a good architect, a wise architect. You know how Paul refers to himself as a good and wise architect in, I believe it's 1 Corinthians 3. That could well be a reference to the Timaeus. The whole point of the demiurgos is to say that he's good and wise, and that means that he follows the blueprints, and the blueprints are the forms and the models of reality. The very first time where we get any hint, possibly like a whiff, on a cool midnight evening, of a wicked demiurge might be Numenius. And Numenius is a 2nd century and northern Syria, Apamea. But the best that you get with him is that the demiurge is sort of just distracted by the world. Not that he's evil, he's just distracted. So the demiurge is has one eye looking up toward the forms, the models, the blueprints of true reality, and he's got one eye, the other eye, so to speak, down looking at the great sea of matter, which the Gnostics tended to call chaos, which is our world. It's Hades and chaos. The Gnostics never needed an underworld because they always referred to our world as hell and chaos.
Have you read Dylan Burns's Did God Care?
Yes, excellent book. It's all about providence.
I believe he might be quoting another scholar, but he says that you could make the case and read the Timaeus that with the demiurge, when he pulled back and he let the young gods take charge, the daemon, Zeus, those are the archons and the demiurge, that his mistake was, all right, I'm in charge, I'm going to let Zeus, bad idea always, right? I'm going to let these guys take over. And that's where the problems start. The real, imperfection enters.
Yeah, to the extent that you have to allow evil among the mortal races. Yes, the demiurge is actually required by necessity to pull back. Because arguably the most important line in the Timaeus is agathos in. And it's about the creator, and it means he was good. He was good. And that's why we live in the best of all possible worlds. We're over 1,000 years before Voltaire, and Plato is saying that we live in the best of all possible worlds. But when there's a potential for evil among the mortal races, which would include the humans and animals, then yes, the demiurge does pull back. And Philo says the same thing. The demiurge pulls back, and those who join our mortal and immortal parts are lower beings whom Philo refers to as powers, and whom, yes, Plato refers to as the younger gods. But those gods definitely are not evil. They're doing the best that they can. And the only enemy in the Timaeus is necessity. And that many people just take as a synonym for matter, that they have a certain material that they work with, and it's irrational by nature. And so they're trying to iron it out and smooth it out so that it's as rational as possible, but it is irrational by nature. So you never end up fully making our world like the blueprint.
I know I'm always on the side of the darkness. That's just who I am. But later, I can't help it. But later on, the Middle Platonists, speaking of sort of Johnny Cash, Kierkegaard mentality, they took Plato pretty dark, didn't they? The world soul was evil. I mean, they were pretty sour existentialists. I mean, they certainly probably would have inspired a lot of the Gnostics.
I would say that's a minority position, and it comes from people like Plutarch. And when Plutarch talks about the errant cause, and Plutarch is unique in this, the errant cause, that is the cause which actually brings the world into error, he seems to be dependent on Persian theology. So he has to reach outside of Platonism to get an evil principle. And that's the principle of Ahriman, or as the Greeks called him, Arimanios, who, fun fact, also appears in the Secret Book of John as the name of a Pharisee. But that's the evil principle that comes in. So it's a Zoroastrian / Persian reading of the Timaeus. And it's a possible reading. I'm not saying it's not possible, but generally, Platonists are cosmic optimists. I don't deny that, like Numenius and Plutarch are pushing in a different direction, but they are more like voices crying out in the wilderness. Yeah,
they're like the kids with leather jackets smoking in the restrooms, kind of part of the school.
Among Platonists, yeah.
With evil demiurgy, we see the similarities between Genesis and Timaeus, in terms of if you're familiar with Russell Gamerkin, they're both similar orders of creation in Genesis and Timaeus. But then there's a few distinct differences, right? Where Timaeus says that God is not a jealous God, and Genesis specifically says that he is. And Genesis says that there were 7 days of creation. Timaeus says that specifically it was timeless. So I wonder if, when we're looking at it, people would see, well, yeah, this good God, that's not the God being referred to in Timaeus. That this Elohim character, that's a different guy. Do you think there's something to that line of thought, that they're two different guys?
There is, because if you look at the Secret Book of John, and I have this on my mind because I'm writing a book on it, whoever is writing the Secret Book of John knows Hebrew as well as Greek. So they say that the two names for God in Genesis are Yahweh and Elohim. Okay, this is, by the way, fun fact, how Julius of Wellhausen in the late 19th century split Genesis into different sources, because he thought that Elohim was one source and that the Yahwist was another source. But these names get combined. So God is referred to as both Yahweh and Elohim, which unfortunately in English doesn't come across, because Elohim is translated God and Yahweh is translated out of reverence. But if you're not religious, it doesn't really matter. It's translated as Lord. But in the Hebrew, it's Yahweh Elohim did such and such. And what the Secret Book of John does is it says, yeah, there was Yahweh and Elohim, and they were two different dudes. And that's actually Cain and Abel. That in the Codex 3, the version that I'm working on, Cain is Yahweh, that's his real name, and Abel is Elohim. And those are real dudes, but those are archons. And then they rename a bunch of other archons, and they rename the chief archon with a combination of names of Yahweh, El, Sabaoth, and they crunch that into Yaldabaoth. So they're very creative. They know Hebrew. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're Jewish, but like magicians, they know Hebrew names and they use them. It doesn't mean that they were Jewish, but they had this book of names that they used because they thought that the names were powerful, and they knew of them and they used them. And they could be used in ritual as well. They probably were. So that's what's going on in the background. And yes, it's a Christian idea that the creator is evil. That's my thesis. Now, others will disagree with me and say that it's a Jewish idea. But I have yet to see anyone really prove to me convincingly that a set of Jews rebelled against their own God. I think it's much more plausible that it's really a kind of Christian criticism of Judaism that says, yeah, we never knew this Yahweh dude. He seems to be local. We're after the universal God. We're not invested in this dude. It's okay to criticize him. Older theories tend to say that, oh, well, the Jews were so traumatized by all the wars that they had, they turned on their own deity. Well, I never bought that as a theory. In fact, if you look at modern examples like of the Shoah or the Holocaust, I mean, faithful Jews don't turn on their deity. There are exceptions like Elie Wiesel, who just become atheists, but they don't actually believe that God exists and that he's evil. That seems to be a distinctly Christian move, and you can call it an anti-Jewish move. I don't think it's necessarily. I think we need to separate in our minds between being anti-creator and anti-Jewish, right? There is a very worthwhile distinction there, and we need to reinforce that. But I'm not defending early Christians. Many of them were anti-Jewish because they're trying to create their own identities, build their own turf. What I would recommend for everyone is don't jump from the Timaeus to Genesis, or don't jump from the Timaeus to the Gnostics. You got to put Philo in the middle, because Philo is someone who is trying to defend Genesis platonically. And then the Gnostics are people who are trying to attack Genesis platonically. And so they're reading the same books, but going in the opposite directions.
Do you think that early Christians knew Philo? We have like beginning of John, and beginning was the word. That seems like Philo. Or was it just that was the thought of the time that everything was Hellenized, so we would necessarily go there? Like the theology of John just seems so much like Philo, and early Christian thought seems so much like Philo. That do you think that, like, for example, the author of John knew Philo?
Possibly. Our first documented use of Philo by Christians is Clement of Alexandria, and in fact, he's got many, many quotes. He plays dirty tricks like many antique authors do by then not naming Philo and then quoting him. So he's the first documented user. I would say I'm convinced that Valentinus used Philo, and I'm convinced that Valentinians are the actual preservers of Philo's library, because you have to think that Philo dies around 50 of the Common Era. And the next person to use Philo is Clement, who's maybe writing at the earliest about 190. But really, by the time he's quoting Philo, it's the year 200. We're already in the 3rd century. Who's preserving the library in between that time? Well, it's not Jews who are wiped out in 117 from Alexandria. It is Christians. And I personally think that it's Gnostic Christians who are preserving Philo. I think it's probably likely that people like Valentinus and Valentinians, possibly Basilides and Carpocrates, knew and used Philo, and someone has to write the article to prove that, and maybe before I die, I will.
Like, just my own personal opinion is I don't really think that most Christians, aside from the ones that we mentioned, knew of Philo. Like I said, Clement, Origen, that's our earliest documented version. But I think the most important thing to take in mind when we talk about Philo of Alexandria is his geographical location. And I think the geographical location and those traditions that native Egyptians and the cosmopolitan world of Alexandria and Egypt in general had of their traditions of, like, say, Typhon Seth and then Yahweh, they're being exposed to these things, the translation of the Septuagint in the 3rd century BCE. Then you have Ezekiel the Tragedian in the 2nd century BCE. Do you think it's more like just a situation like with a negative demiurgy? Do you think it's because they're in this Alexandrian milieu and they have these traditions around them of Yahweh being interpreted as like a version of Typhon Seth? So it's not hard for Christians who come along later after the massacres and the revolts in Alexandria to put 2 and 2 together, because it's around all the time, right? I don't know what you thought about that.
So in my book, The Evil Creator, I make exactly that argument, that the evil creator is a pre-Christian idea, but it's the Christians who run with it, right? So it's a pre-Christian idea insofar as way back with Ezekiel the Tragedian, he's our first witness to the fact that the Jewish myth of the Exodus is well known, probably in the 3rd certainly by the 2nd century BCE. Okay, so at least 200 years before Jesus. And you have to imagine that the Exodus myth, I mean, it's wonderful for Jews, but it is the worst possible press for Egyptians. And unlike what we have today, there were genuine Egyptians who spoke the native Egyptian language in Alexandria and in Egypt more broadly, and who had their own native religious traditions. And to have them hear a play or listen to a reading about the Jewish God killing the sons of their Pharaoh, the sons of all native Egyptians, poisoning their sacred river, which, by the way, the Nile is a god to Egypt. So you poison the river, you turn it to blood, you kill all the fish, you fill Egypt with flies and gnats and frogs. You put the land in utter darkness, starve people by casting disease on their cattle, etc., etc. All these plagues hit the Egyptians as kind of anti-Egyptian mythography. And they punched back, and they punched back hard by saying that the only God who would inflict that kind of damage is, well, we would say he's a terrorist. Or the Egyptians, the only God who would hurt that many people and actually kill people, including babies, has to be Seth. Because they don't have the devil, he's yet to be invented, but they do have their own native donkey-headed, demon-like God, who is God of deserts and is associated with the color red and with wild winds and sandstorms. And that's a perfect example of Yahweh, because Yahweh, he loves deserts, he loves to plague people, well, people who aren't his people, and he's trying to take them away from Egypt. Seth is also the god of foreigners. So you can see how the Egyptians would make that connection. And largely they're responding to the Exodus mythology that's already in place. When the Septuagint gets translated, it's no secret that there's a Disney version called, I think, The Prince of Egypt. But really, if you were a native Egyptian who heard the Exodus story, you would be puking or duking. I mean, it's really, really anti-Egypt. And so they punched back, and they created the evil creator as bad press for the Jewish people in Egypt. And then the Christians, when they had cut ties with the Jews, ran with it. And some of them are still running.
As you pointed out elsewhere, the god was named Hiha. And so I'm sure the Egyptians, when the Israelites were saying the name of their god, which I guess it wasn't taboo to say back in those days, and they thought, gosh, you people are stupid.
Well, not Hiha, that's the anglicized version of it, but the Old Greek pronunciation was Ya'o, and the native Egyptian word for donkey was Yo. And they were similar enough to make jokes about it, yes. Now, there are people who resist that conclusion, but I think that's quite plausible that they did make that association based on the name itself. Yeah. Ya'o sounded enough like yo to make them laugh.
We have the earliest reference of Christianity, the graffiti, Alexander worships his god, right? And it's a donkey-headed crucifix.
Yeah.
Do we think there's a connection there?
I present an argument in my book that, yes, there's a continuous tradition that goes up until, yes, that graffito of identifying, in this case, the Jewish God, who, if you're not Jewish and you're not Christian, you just assume that the Jewish God is also the Christian God. Obviously, the Gnostics would very much disagree with that. But by and large, whoever wrote the Alexamenos graffito or scrawled it on a wall was assuming that the Christian God was the Jewish one. In that case, he is tapping into the other associations with the donkey, which is stupidity. And that's not necessarily associated with Seth Typhon. Seth is actually a very smart and sagacious, but it's the Romans who associated the donkey with stupidity. And they just thought that, yeah, if you worship a crucified God, that's just sheer stupidity. I mean, let's face it, like, if you're going to worship anybody, if you're going to strive to be like anybody, try not to get your book crucified. I mean, honestly, I mean, it's just like common sense here, folks.
Yeah, yeah, he got his ass kicked. You got to bet with the winner.
Right.
I thought they had left us, but man, the apocalyptic evangelical preachers come back with a vengeance in the last 2 weeks. I'm like, oh my God, they've returned. They're back for obvious reasons. And loves a certain piece of real estate, and Jesus is going to bring his sword down on people. Kind of.
We live in a world where evil is real and where people in the name of God cut off the heads of babies and rape women and do things that were barbarous, 5,000 years ago. Stuff that we read in the Bible happened 3 weeks ago, of like the most horrific, villainous evil. And they're doing it in the name of God. I think they're doing it in at the command of God. And that God that they worship, they think is the creator. So the evil creator is very much among us. And you have to believe that the early Christians are thinking in similar ways. They didn't have terrorists in antiquity, but they did have the Bar Kokhba revolt, in which, as it's documented by Justin and others, that Bar Kokhba, who was a Jewish rebel leader, was killing Christians who said that Jesus was the Messiah and doing just horrific things to people who disobeyed him. And Judea was a war-torn land. I mean, they were doing atrocities. And then the Romans did the final atrocity by actually banning Jews from Jerusalem and the districts around Jerusalem when they won that war. But you got to think that, who's around at this time? It's Marcion, it's Basilides, it's Carpocrates. These are the people who are looking at the Judean God as if he's some kind of monster. And why do they do that? Because, yes, it's in the Bible. This is the argument that I make. But here, they're also listening on their own equivalent of the news, just as we are, of people doing atrocious acts in the name of a creator. And, you can have a just sheer atheist response to this, which is fine, but you can also have a religious response to this. And the religious response to the terroristic atrocities is to really actually think, well, yes, terrorists do worship a real God, and that God may be the creator, but that God is utterly, utterly evil. And we need to face that. And they are doing his commands. They aren't deceived, right? Because the temptation is to say, well, which is kind of writing these people off, right? You write these people off when you have a case where, oh, these people are just misinterpreting their own tradition. Maybe they are, but I think that from their perspective, they are obeying the commands of the creator. So if you think that the God that they worship is real, I don't see how you can avoid saying that that God is evil. I really don't. This is our world.
It makes you wonder, like with apologists, let's say Calvinists, for example, where most people are just predestined for eternal torment, that they didn't really have any choice in it. You could say their God is evil, right? But they'll just say that our conceptions of what evil, or that good is basically what God is, and evil is what he's not. So by definition, God is good, and his actions can only be good, right? So you could kind of look at that as evil demiurgy, right? Kind of along the same lines as what you were saying.
My own sense of both Calvinists and evangelicals is that they would have an apologetic maneuver in order to avoid having to take the kind of line that you're talking about, the kind of hard predestination. More, God knows everything, and it all works out for good, and he has everybody in mind, and we need to look at the whole big picture, and et cetera, and goodness has to include justice. These are classic apologetic and evangelical arguments, but when it gets right down to it, you really are in a situation where you have to look at the God of terrorists, and the God of terrorists is the God who kills babies and rapes women. And there's no way of avoiding it when it's that stark. And then you can turn to the Calvinists and say, well, do you or do you not think that God predetermines babies to burn in hell forever? Isn't that the same thing? and then you can kind of corner them. But I think ultimately they would want to back out of that somehow.
Sometimes I wonder, and some scholars have said that it was a mistake for Plato to ever make the philosopher's God public. Should have been kept in the mystery religions because, there was a time when the gods were not supposed to be perfect or all good or moral or even immortal. They were just sort of they were up the ladder. They helped humanity. They took care of the tribes, but we didn't put them up so much on a pedestal where evangelicals and are like, well, he created the universe, he created it, so therefore he has to be all good. So therefore, the ancients before Plato would have been like, what are you talking about? Gods are just gods. So it's a pity.
Ultimately, when you're talking about deities, you're talking about power, and gods are just beings with more power than other people, and that can be good or evil.
Exactly.
I'm
But
gonna
if
switch
you
to
assume
Helios
your
here.
God is all good and everything he's done is perfect, that's when you get into a position that it's almost paradoxical. So a lot of cognitive dissonance. When you have who's the one who did he did a huge work out. I'm drawing a blank on the Nassenes. Who was that? I think he equates the Nassene ritual with the Eleusinian mysteries, doesn't it? What do you think about that? Do you think he was just throwing it out there, or do you think there's something valid to it?
Well, it's not the refutator who's doing that. It's the Nicene preacher himself who is looking into the Eleusinian cult and saying that that's actually Jesus that they're talking about. For the Nicene preacher, yes, absolutely. All the mysteries are about Jesus, which is why he's so extraordinary. He's the most cosmopolitan, open minded Christian, I think, perhaps of all time. Usually Christians are, trying to close down the temples and freaking out and saying that they are the inhabitations of demons and bringing torches and pitchforks and yelling. But the Nicene preacher is like, bring them all in. It's all about Jesus. I mean, he's sort of like the best analogy I can give is like Gandhi, who said, I'm a Hindu, but I'm also a Christian and I'm also a Muslim and I'm a bunch of other things too. I'm a Buddhist. I mean, that's sort of like the Nicene attitude. In a way, it's cultural appropriation, but in another way, it's very ironic. So he's trying to say that, Jesus is everywhere. Even in these pagan cults, you can't give that up to the demons. And so, yes, absolutely. He tries to figure out everything he can about Eleusis and tries to relate it to Jesus. And I think he's quite successful. That's why he's so beloved today. But generally, I would say only among those who know him, which is about 5 people in the world. But hopefully that will change, thanks to you and to others who will spread the Nicene gospel of peace, love, and weirdness, and second sophistic epidatic speeches. That one's for
Yeah.
Jason.
I love the Nassenes. Yeah, I guess he was the first perennialist. Those, like you said, Gandhi,
Oh, yeah.
Blavatsky, all these people that all religions are one and Jesus Christ consciousness and all that sort of pre-hippie dippy good stuff. Way ahead of his times.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's like the pure juice, the golden sap coming straight from Alexandria. If we had that kind of Christianity, boy, I'd be the first one in church. Hey, give me some of that Eleusinian rites, I'll take it. Don't close down the place. We need to keep it open. I mean, curse you, Justinian, for closing down the Eleusinian cult. I mean, big, big, big mistake. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, well, as they say, the victories write history and the idiots edit Wikipedia. I love that new saying too. That's a new addendum. I think it was Elon Musk who said it. What's your favorite Halloween movies, David? Or horror movies?
Oh, I'm a complete wuss when it comes to horror movies, because they actually do frighten me and keep me up at night. I mean, any movie based on the Bible, that's enough to scare me or bring me to tears. Any Bible remake of, Paul's Adventures or Jesus of Nazareth, that scares me to death. I just pray to God that I don't need to watch any of that.
Have you watched The Passion of the Christ? That was pretty cool.
I was just going to say that.
Oh yeah, that's an excellent horror film. Yeah, I mean,
I
honestly.
liked it. You know why? Because I was thinking, I'm sure in ancient times when you do the mysteries of Osiris or some god, and they got dressed up and had their bad special effects. I'm sure the audience was like, "Oh, this god is dying," and I mean, for them this was CGI, and they must have been terrorized. So it's like I understand the idea of making it as gory as possible to your tribe, because I think in ancient times that's exactly what they did. If they didn't scare the s out of you, you weren't going to have a mystical experience, right? So,
Mhm. And you'd be on
Yeah,
some
that
kind of
actually
hallucinogen while you were watching it, so it's even
yeah,
more
Kaikion or something like that.
there is a new movie which I want to see. There's a movie now called The Creator, and it's
I want
about
to
an
see it
evil
too.
robot. Apparently, I'd love to do a movie review of that. I think that the idea is out there. The idea is loose on the world. The evil creator idea. It's really one of the scarier ideas of humanity. But you've really got to face it. Otherwise, you're not going to understand terrorism. And we need to understand terrorism. We just can't avoid it. It's just here. It's here in 2023. It's all over the place. I mean, the news is drenched in blood every night. The idea is loose. I mean, scary, scary, scary. That's why I say, you should put a mature rating on this, Jason, because I just hope and pray that
Yeah.
people have the right idea. When they face the evil creator, we've got to face him, but let's just not worship him, please.
Yeah, at the same
Yeah,
time, we
they're
have to
they're
know what they're using
contrary.
against us because statistically speaking, the facts are is that we have less wars and death through wars than we have in 100 years. I know the media wants to make it seem like this is the end of the world, but we also have to keep things. I think human beings are wiser. I mean, it's a fact. There's less wars, less violence. We get what the news gives us, and we think it's the end of the world. Having said that, the problem is that we are monkeys with nuclear weapons, so it takes one mess up, and part of the world is going to burn, and millions will die, or one gas. So that's sort of where we are. It's this weird place. So the evil creator is a lot smarter than you think.
Evolution is going too slow. Yeah. Um, and unfortunately, I mean, I have to say that I really do think in some areas there is true devolution. Yeah, we're in trouble in some respects. Let's
Yeah,
just hope we evolve fast enough so that the planet doesn't die. That's the biggie. But I'd like to end on a note of hope. I mean, I think Halloween is a great time. And since this is a Halloween special, and it's always been my favorite holiday since I was a kid, it's a great time to reflect on evil, to kind of have fun with it, to identify it in ourselves. That's the whole point of the dressing up as goblins and ghouls, and to face it. The evil creator, he's inside. Um,
shadow
and
work, young shadow, simple.
yeah, he's not just on the news, although you're made more aware of him there. But yeah, the demiurgos, the engineer of evil, in the Greek hakatizon kaka, the one who creates the evils, that's on the inside.
Mm.
And I hope that in facing that, you overcome it. Take care, and thanks to everybody for coming. And I'll see everybody soon, I hope.
Take care, David. Happy Halloween.
I'll see.